The gate to the Okonkwo compound had never been opened for him. Not once in 3 years of marriage to Adaeze. Okonkwo had Chukwuma Eze been the kind of man her father opened gates for. Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo had built his fortune across 4 decades of infrastructure contracts and land acquisitions in Enugu State, and he had spent those same 4 decades developing the specific, unhurried ability to read men accurately on first encounter. He had read Chukwuma on the evening Adaeze brought him home for the first time, had read him the way you read a document that is missing something important and has been submitted anyway by someone hoping you will not notice. He had noticed. He had said nothing. He had allowed his daughter to make her choice because Adaeze was 32 years old and had the right to make her choices, and because Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo believed, with the patient certainty of someone who had watched enough cycles complete themselves, that certain truths did not need to be spoken in order to arrive. He had simply begun, quietly, to prepare. Chukwuma did not know this. He had no reason to know it. He was a mechanic, good at his work, honest about what he could fix and what he could not, possessed of the specific dignity that comes from doing necessary things well for a long time. He had met Adaeze at a wedding in Abuja, where he was attending as a guest of the groom, and she was attending as a friend of the bride, and they had spoken for 3 hours on a terrace that smelled of frangipani and the particular quality of Lagos-adjacent social confidence that certain events produce. He had not known who she was. She had not told him. When he found out weeks later, he had not changed. That was the thing Adaeze had loved about him first, that knowing had not changed him. What Adaeze did not know was that knowing had changed other things. Not Chukwuma himself, but Chukwuma's understanding of what was available to him and what that availability permitted. It was a subtle distinction. It lived below the level of conscious decision-making, in the territory where ambition and comfort blur together into something that does not yet have a name, but is already doing its work. He had met Ngozi at his workshop 18 months into the marriage. She came with a Toyota Camry that had a transmission problem and a directness that he found, at first, simply interesting. She was 27, worked in sales for a telecom company, and approached everything including the broken transmission with the specific cheerful pragmatism of someone who had decided early that obstacles were simply logistics problems waiting to be solved. She laughed easily. She did not have the weight of the Okonkwo name in the room with her. She did not have expectations built from 4 decades of accumulated significance. She was simply there, and interested in him. Chukwuma told himself it was nothing. Then he told himself it was temporary. Then he stopped telling himself anything, and allowed the situation to become what it had always been becoming. If you have ever watched someone make the same mistake in slow motion, understanding exactly what it will cost, and being unable to look away, stay with me. Because this story is not about betrayal. It is about what happens when a man mistakes his wife's silence for surrender and discovers too late the difference between a woman who has nothing and a woman who is waiting. Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo died on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years after Chukwuma and Adaeze's wedding. He died the way he had lived, without spectacle, without unnecessary declaration. His housekeeper found him in his study at 7 in the morning, seated in his chair, his reading glasses still on, a document on the desk in front of him that his lawyer, Barrister Obiora Nwosu, would later describe as the final amendment to his will. It had been signed. It had been witnessed. It required nothing further from anyone. Adaeze received the call at 6:15. She had already been awake for an hour. She had been awake for an hour because 3 weeks earlier a text message had arrived on her husband's phone. She had not been looking. She had simply been present, and presence sometimes delivers information that seeking never finds. And she had read it in the 2 seconds before she understood what she was reading, and 3 seconds after. The message was from a contact saved as N. It said, "The doctor confirmed it. 14 weeks. Call me when you can." Adaeze had set the phone down on the kitchen counter exactly where she had found it. She had completed making the coffee. She had drunk it standing at the window watching the Abuja morning arrange itself outside. Then she had gone to her father, not to tell him. He was already ill. The cancer had been progressing for 8 months, managed but not reversing, the kind of illness that sharpens everything it touches. She had not gone to tell him. She had gone because she needed to be in the presence of someone who understood things before they were spoken, and Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo had always been that person for her. She had sat in his study for 4 hours. They had spoken about his land holdings in Nasuka. They had spoken about the infrastructure project in Auka that his company had completed the previous year. They had spoken about her mother, who had died when Adaeze was 9, and who Chief Emmanuel had never replaced, not because he lacked opportunity, but because he lacked interest in replacement. He had spoken about her the way he always spoke about her, as a fact that had happened and remained happening the way certain facts do. At the end of the 4 hours, Chief Emmanuel had said, "Adaeze, you are prepared." She had not asked what he meant. She had simply said, "Yes, Papa." That had been 3 weeks before his death. In those 3 weeks, Adaeze had done several things. She had met with Barrister Nwosu, not to initiate anything, but to understand what already existed, what structures her father had built, what protections were already in place. She had reviewed documents she had been given at her wedding and filed without reading thoroughly, because at the time she had been too full of the future to examine its architecture. She had made calls. She had kept records. She had done all of this without noise, without confrontation, without once asking Chukwuma to explain the message on his phone. Confrontation, she understood, was what people chose when they lacked alternatives. She had alternatives. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. The Okonkwo family compound in Enugu was large enough to accommodate 200 people without pressure, and Chief Emmanuel had made it known during his lifetime that he intended a dignified burial. Not ostentatious, not performative, but correct. The compound smelled of the specific combination of red earth and harmattan dust, and the particular vegetation that grew along the eastern wall, and the reception hall had been arranged with a precision that reflected his character. Everything in its right place, nothing excessive, the atmosphere of a space that knew why it existed. Adaeze arrived 2 hours before the service. She wore black, simple, precise. The black of someone who had made a decision about how to present themselves and had committed to it entirely. She moved through the compound greeting family, receiving condolences, managing the specific logistics of grief that fall to the person who is both most bereaved and most capable. She spoke to caterers. She confirmed the order of service with the pastor. She thanked the women who had come from her father's church to sing. She did everything with the composed, unhurried efficiency that people who watched her would later describe as extraordinary self-control. It was not self-control. It was preparation. Chukwuma arrived 40 minutes into the service. The gate opened for him. It had to open. He was the husband of the chief's daughter, and gates follow protocol regardless of what they might prefer. And he came through it with Ngozi beside him. She was visibly pregnant. 7 months, by Adaeze's estimation, looking at her from across the compound. She wore a black dress that had been chosen to acknowledge the occasion while accommodating the pregnancy. Someone had thought about this, had decided this was the correct presentation for this specific moment. Chukwuma's hand was at the small of her back, not tentative, present. The compound noticed. The compound noticed the way spaces notice things that violate their established order, not with noise, but with a collective adjustment, a slight realignment of attention that moved through the gathered mourners like a slow current. Conversations did not stop. They became quieter. Eyes moved without heads turning. The specific social calculation of a Nigerian family gathering, who was present, in what configuration, for what apparent reason, was being performed at high speed by 200 people simultaneously. Adaeze was standing near the entrance to the reception hall when they came through the gate. She saw them. She looked at them for exactly the time required to confirm what she was seeing and understand its meaning. Then she turned back to the woman she had been speaking with, a cousin of her father's from Onitsha, 70 years old, who had been describing the road she had taken to get here. And she continued the conversation. This was, for everyone who witnessed it, the most unsettling thing that happened that day. Not Chukwuma's arrival, not Ngozi's presence, not the pregnancy that made the arithmetic of the situation self-evident to anyone paying attention. The most unsettling thing was Adaeze's non-response, because Adaeze Okonkwo Eze was known, in the family and among her father's associates, as a woman of precision, a woman who noticed things, a woman who, when something required attention, gave it complete and deliberate attention. Her non-response was therefore not readable as ignorance or shock. It was readable as choice. And choice in a moment like this meant something that no one in that compound could yet fully interpret. Chukwuma felt it. He felt the specific, crawling awareness of a man who has done something he believed was decisive and is discovering that the person it was done to has not responded in the way that decisiveness requires. He had expected. He could not have articulated this expectation clearly, but it existed. He had expected something that would make the moment legible. Anger. Tears. A confrontation that would force the situation into the open and give it the shape of a crisis, which was a shape he could navigate. He was good at navigating crises. He was good at talking his way through difficult rooms. Adaeze gave him nothing to navigate. She moved through the funeral with the same composure she had shown upon arrival. She spoke to people. She received embraces. She sat in the front row during the service with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the pastor and her father's casket. And she did not look at Chukwuma, not because she was avoiding him, but because he was not the most important thing in the room. Her father was the most important thing in the room. She gave him her attention. Chukwuma sat 3 rows back with Ngozi beside him. He could see the back of Adaeze's head, the precise way her hair was arranged, the stillness of her shoulders. And he felt the specific discomfort of someone who has brought a weapon to a confrontation and discovered that the other person is not interested in being confronted. Ngozi whispered to him once during the service. He did not register what she said. After the service, when the family gathered in the main reception room for the meal that followed burial, Adaeze's aunt, her father's younger sister, a woman named Mama Chidinma, who had the specific authority of someone who had earned the right to say what others were only thinking, approached Chukwuma near the entrance. She stood in front of him and looked at Ngozi with the unhurried assessment of a woman who is placing something into a category. And then she looked at Chukwuma. She said, in Igbo, "You brought this woman to your father-in-law's funeral." It was not a question. Chukwuma said, "Mama Chidinma." She said, "I am speaking." She said it quietly, the way quiet things are said when the person saying them has absolute confidence in their own authority. "You brought a pregnant woman who is not your wife to the burial of your wife's father." She paused. "I want to be sure I understand correctly." Around them, other people were not looking directly, but were entirely attentive. Chukwuma said, "Things have changed between Adaeze and me. We have." Mama Chidinma said, "You will not explain yourself to me here." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has made a decision about a person and sees no reason to revisit it. "I am simply confirming what I see." She looked at Ngozi one more time, not with cruelty, but with the clear, assessing look of someone marking a fact. And then she walked away. Ngozi's hand tightened on Chukwuma's arm. He did not look at her. Adaeze, from across the room, had observed this exchange. She did not intervene, did not approach, did not acknowledge it. She was speaking with Barrister Nwosu, who had arrived an hour earlier, and who she had been waiting to speak with since the service ended. They stood near the window that looked onto the eastern garden, where the vegetation grew against the wall, and they spoke quietly and at some length. Barrister Nwosu did most of the speaking. Adaeze listened and nodded, occasionally asking a question, her face carrying the focused attention of someone receiving information they have been expecting and need to receive accurately. At one point during this conversation, Barrister Nwosu removed a document from the leather folder he carried and showed it to her. She read it. She nodded once. She handed it back. Chukwuma watched this from across the room without being able to hear anything or see the document clearly. He watched his wife standing in quiet conversation with her father's lawyer at her father's burial reception. And he felt the specific unease of someone who is outside a conversation that may be about them. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself the legal matters were straightforward, an estate to be settled, property to be arranged, the standard business of death in a family of this kind. He told himself this because he had not asked. He had not asked because he had not thought to ask. Because for 3 years of marriage to Adaeze Okonkwo, he had allowed himself a comfortable vagueness about her family's financial architecture. He knew her father was wealthy. He did not know what wealthy meant in specific terms, what structures existed, what documents had been prepared, what her father had spent 4 decades building toward and for whom. He had not asked because not asking felt easier than knowing, and because vagueness had a comfort that specificity destroys. This had been his error, not the only one, but perhaps the foundational one. Later, as the reception thinned and people began their departures, Adaeze came to stand beside him for the first time since his arrival. She did not announce herself. She simply appeared at his shoulder in the way she had always appeared at his shoulder, quietly, without warning, with the specific presence of someone who has been paying attention to a great many things simultaneously and has now redirected it toward you. He turned to look at her. She was looking at Ngozi, who was seated near the far wall, speaking to no one, her hands resting on her abdomen with the particular, self-contained patience of a woman in late pregnancy at a gathering where she knows no one. He said, "Adaeze." She said, "Don't." He stopped. She said without looking at him, "I am burying my father today." She said it with no particular emphasis, the way facts are stated when their weight is self-evident. "Whatever you need to say to me, you will say it another day." She paused. "Not today." He said, "I thought you should know. I thought it was better to be honest than to—" She said, "You did not come here to be honest." She turned and looked at him then, directly, with the clear, measuring gaze that he had watched her use on other people and had always been glad was not directed at him. "You came here because you wanted me to react." She held his gaze for a moment. "I won't." She walked away. He stood in his father-in-law's reception room with the sound of departing guests around him and the smell of the eastern garden coming through the window, and he understood for the first time, with genuine clarity, that the situation he was in was not the situation he had believed he was in. He had believed he was in a situation where he held the initiative, where his choices were shaping the circumstances, where Adaeze's quietness indicated that she was behind him, absorbing, waiting to be told what the new arrangement would be. He was not in that situation. He did not yet know what situation he was in. He found out 11 days later, when Barrister Nwosu called to inform him that the reading of Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo's will had been scheduled for the following Wednesday, and that his presence was not required, but that Adaeze had asked that he be informed. He arrived at Barrister Nwosu's office on Wednesday morning with the confidence of a man who has talked himself into believing that uncertainty is temporary. The office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Independence Layout in Enugu, clean and quietly functional. The kind of office that existed to process important things without making them feel important, which was itself a form of precision. Barrister Nwosu met him with the practiced courtesy of a lawyer who has delivered difficult news often enough to have developed a methodology for it. Adaeze was already there. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, her posture composed, wearing the same quiet attention she had worn at the funeral. Mama Chidinma was there. 2 of Chief Emmanuel's business associates were there. A woman Chukwuma did not recognize sat to Adaeze's right with a laptop and a leather notebook. He sat down. Barrister Nwosu began. Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo's estate was extensive. The reading took 40 minutes and covered land holdings in 4 states, 2 operational businesses, investment portfolios, residential properties in Enugu and Abuja, and a set of trust arrangements that had been formalized 18 months ago. 18 months ago, Chukwuma noted, was approximately when his marriage had begun its slow change of direction, through a legal structure that Barrister Nwosu described as specifically designed to protect the estate's assets from any claim that might arise from marital dissolution. The total value, at current assessment, was in the range of $50 million. Sole beneficiary, Adaeze Okonkwo Eze, with one structural provision. In the event of divorce or legal separation occurring within 5 years of Chief Emmanuel's death, the assets would transfer into a protected trust administered by Barrister Nwosu's firm, inaccessible to any claim from a former spouse, reverting entirely and unconditionally to Adaeze upon finalization of any separation proceedings. Chief Emmanuel had, in other words, anticipated this precisely. He had built a structure that not only protected his daughter's inheritance, but rendered any claim against it legally impossible. He had not done this in anger. He had not done this as punishment. He had done this with the calm, methodical foresight of a man who understood human behavior well enough to prepare for its predictable patterns. Chukwuma sat very still. He heard the figure. He heard the provision. He heard the words sole beneficiary and protected trust and inaccessible to claim. He heard them the way you hear something that does not immediately make sense because it contradicts the version of reality you have been living in, and the contradiction is large enough that the brain requires a moment to rebuild its map around the new information. He said, when the reading was complete, he knew. Barrister Nwosu looked at him. He said, Chief Emmanuel was a thorough man. Chukwuma looked at Adaeze. She was looking at her hands on the table. She was not performing composure. She simply was composed in the deep structural way that people are composed when they have had sufficient time to prepare and have used that time well. He said, Adaeze. She looked up. He said, how long have you known? She said, 3 weeks before he died. She said it simply. He showed me the documents himself. He said, and at the funeral. She said, at the funeral I was burying my father. The distinction was clean and devastating. He had come to the funeral with his pregnant mistress believing he was making a statement, believing he was declaring something, believing that the force of his presence, the unambiguity of Ngozi's visible pregnancy, would compel a response that would clarify the situation on his terms. Adaeze had been at the funeral burying her father and receiving confirmation of a $50 million inheritance, structured specifically to survive whatever he chose to do next. He had mistaken her composure for helplessness. She had been waiting, not bitterly, not strategically in any cruel sense, but simply with the patient, organized stillness of a woman who understood that truth, when it arrives, does not need to be announced. Mama Chidinma, from her seat beside Adaeze, looked at Chukwuma with the expression she had worn in the compound. She did not speak. She did not need to. The woman with the laptop, who was, Chukwuma understood now, Adaeze's personal lawyer, already retained, already briefed, placed a document on the table in front of him without comment. It was a notice of intent to file for legal separation, already prepared, requiring only his acknowledgement of receipt. He looked at it. He looked at Adaeze. She said, "You don't need to sign anything today." She said it without coldness, with the straightforward clarity that had always been her characteristic mode. "This is just so you have the information." He said, Adaeze, She said, "Not today, Chukwuma." She said his name with the even, factual quality of someone who has already processed what it costs and has decided that the cost is manageable. Whatever there is to say, we will say it properly, through our lawyers. She paused. "Not in Barrister Nwosu's office on the day after my father's will is read." He said nothing. Outside, Enugu continued. The traffic and the generators and the persistent noise of a city that had been running its calculations long before this particular reckoning and would continue running them long after. He picked up the document. He did not sign it. He folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket. He stood. He looked at Adaeze one more time. At this woman he had married because she was steady and intelligent and did not perform. At this woman he had underestimated with the specific efficiency of someone who mistakes quietness for absence. And he understood something that he would spend a long time afterward wishing he had understood sooner. She had not been quiet because she had nothing to say. She had been quiet because she already knew how the story ended, and she had been waiting, with her father's patience and her father's precision, for the moment when everyone else caught up. He left the office. Adaeze watched him go without expression. Mama Chidinma put her hand over Adaeze's on the table. Neither of them spoke. The room held the particular quality of silence that exists after something large has been completed. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of arrival, the silence that a thing makes when it has finally become what it was always going to become. Barrister Nwosu gathered his documents. The woman with the laptop made a note. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Adaeze sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the door through which her husband had left, and she felt not triumph, not satisfaction, not the specific pleasure of a reversal achieved. She felt what her father had always said preceded the right decisions: clarity. The flat, clean, reliable clarity of someone who has done the difficult thing in the right way and can now, finally, move forward. 6 months later, the separation was finalized without contest. The trust structure her father had built held exactly as designed. Chukwuma's lawyer, a man who had reviewed the documents for 3 weeks and had called Chukwuma on a Tuesday afternoon to tell him, with the restrained precision of someone delivering an unpleasant but unalterable fact, that there was nothing to contest and no mechanism by which to contest it, had ultimately advised him to proceed without objection. He had proceeded without objection. Ngozi's daughter was born in January. Chukwuma named her Amaka. He went back to his workshop in Abuja, to the transmission problems and the engine diagnostics and the specific, honest work of fixing things that were broken, and he did that work with the same competence he had always brought to it, because competence was his, and the circumstances had not changed it. Adaeze took 2 weeks after the finalization to go to Enugu. She went to the compound, to her father's study, where the reading glasses were still on the desk. She had asked the housekeeper to leave them, and she sat in his chair for a long time in the afternoon light that came through the eastern window. The window looked onto the garden, where the vegetation grew against the wall. The light at this hour was the color of the particular gold that only exists for 40 minutes in the late afternoon, and then becomes something else. She did not read anything. She did not review documents or make plans. She simply sat in her father's chair in her father's light and understood, with the quiet, total certainty of something that has been true for a long time and has simply been waiting to be understood. That preparation was its own form of love. That her father had spent years building something not as a weapon, but as a shelter. Not to punish anyone, but to protect her. Not because he distrusted the world, but because he understood it. And understanding it had made him careful in the specific, loving way that certain people are careful, the way you are careful with things that matter. She was prepared, he had said, 3 weeks before his death. "Yes, Papa," she had said. She had been right. The light changed. The gold became orange, and the orange became the first grey of evening. Adaeze sat in the chair until the room was mostly dark, and then she turned on the lamp on the desk and she looked at the document that was still there. Not the will, but something else. A letter her father had left for her specifically, separate from the legal documents, handwritten in his precise, unhurried hand. She had not been ready to read it until now. She read it now. It was not long. It did not explain itself or apologize for anything, or offer advice about the future. It simply said, in the measured, factual language that had been his lifelong mode, "You have always understood what mattered. Trust that. The rest is already handled." She folded the letter. She placed it in her bag. She turned off the lamp. She sat for another moment in the dark. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the study into the compound, where the evening air smelled of red earth and the particular vegetation against the eastern wall. And she moved forward. Leave a comment. What was the moment in this story that told you everything about who Adaeze was? We read everyone. We are here every week.